Hey guys, and welcome back. Here's another one of my monologues. I really hope you guys enjoy it. This isn't random, and it's not something that just snaps overnight. When we look at extreme acts of violence, whether it's inside a home, in a community, or even on a larger scale like terrorism, we are not looking at one type of person. We are looking at a pattern, and more often than not, that pattern has forming long before anyone decided to take it seriously. That's the uncomfortable truth because people want a simple answer. They want to believe there's a clear profile, a clear warning label, something obvious that separates those people from everyone else. But psychology doesn't work that way. Human behavior doesn't work that way. What we actually see over and over again is a combination of traits, stress, and the coming together over time, building the pressure until something breaks. One of the most misunderstood pieces of the puzzle is narcissism. The word itself gets thrown around and constantly. People hear narcissist and immediately think dangerous or unstable or even violent. But the reality is far more nuanced. Narcissism exists on a spectrum. At a lower levels, it can look like confidence or ambition or self-focus, traits that are incredibly common in most societies. So let's be clear about this. Most people with narcissistic traits are not violent. That matters because if we misunderstood the trait, we miss the real risk. The danger doesn't come with narcissism alone, it comes from what happens when those traits are pushed to the extreme, especially when they collide with stress, instability, and what psychologists call a narcissistic injury. The injury happens when someone feels rejected or humiliated or disrespected or stripped of their identity. It could be a breakup, a custody battle, losing a job, losing status, or losing control. And for some individuals, that doesn't just feel like a setback, it feels like everything is collapsing at once. That's when something called narcissistic rage can emerge. Not just anger, and it's not just frustration, but a deep, overwhelming need to regain control to restore identity or to punish whoever is perceived as the cause of the pain. And in rare cases, that emotional state can turn outward in devastating ways. But here's the key point: narcissism alone doesn't create the violence. The real danger shows up when it combines with other high risk traits. We're talking about lack of empathy, emotional instability, and impulsivity, and most importantly, antisocial tendencies, which researchers show are far more strongly linked to violent behavior than narcissism by itself. When you mix those traits together and then a real world pressure, you start to see the experts call a perfect storm, and those pressures are not theoretical, they're real. Divorce, custody battles, and financial collapse, isolation, loss of purpose. These are kinds of traits that don't just change someone's circumstances, they change how someone sees themselves. And for certain individuals, that shift can feel like an identity crisis. That's when escalation begins, not instantly, but in stages. And this is where the conversation becomes critical because almost every time there are warning signs, there are prior threats. Controlling or coercive behavior, emotional volatility is a growing sense of grievance or fixation or blame, and access to weapons during the moments of that instability. Those are not suitable signals, they are patterns. But here's the problem: we see them and we explain them away. We call it a bad relationship. We say someone is just stressed. We assume it's a private matter. And in doing that, we miss the moment where intervention could actually make a difference. Because once escalation reaches a certain point, the response becomes almost impossible. Now let's take a step back and look at this on a larger scale. When we talk about terrorism, especially domestic terrorism, the scale changes, the targets change, and sometimes the ideology changes. But the underlying psychology, in many cases, it follows a similar path. Grievance, identity crisis, perceived injustice, a need for meaning or control or recognition. These are powerful drivers, and when someone begins to connect their personal frustrations to a larger narrative, whether it's political, social, or ideological, that's where radicalization can begin. It doesn't happen overnight, it builds over time through reinforcement, through isolation, through exposure to environments or communities that validate that belief or those beliefs. And slowly the line between thought and action start to blur. The violence, which once seemed unthinkable, begins to feel justified and even necessary. That's the danger. And just like in domestic cases, the warning signs are often there: escalating rhetoric, dehumanization of others, obsession with a cause of grievance, withdrawal from opposing viewpoints, and a sense that violence is the only solution. These are not random changes, they are indicators of escalation. Now, here's the reality that makes this conversation difficult, but it is necessary statistically, and extreme violence is rare. A very small percentage of the population will ever commit acts like this. Even among individuals with personality disorders, the majority will never become violent. That's the reassuring part. But here's the part that should concern us. The patterns of escalation is not rare, and the warning signs are not rare. The missed opportunities to intervene are not rare. That's what repeats itself over and over again. And that's where the real issue is. Because prevention isn't about predicting exactly who will commit an act of violence. That's not realistic. It's about recognizing when someone is moving in that direction and taking it seriously before it's too late. That requires awareness, and it requires communication, and it requires a shift in how we think about these situations. We can't keep treating domestic instability as something completely private when there are clear signs of escalation. We can't ignore the behavioral patterns just because they're uncomfortable to address, because the cost of ignoring them is far too high. This isn't just about psychology, it is about the systems, it's about communities, and it's about whether we are willing to act on what we already see, because the truth is, these events don't come out of nowhere. They come from a buildup, from patterns, from warning signs that were there long before the outcome. And if there's anything to take away from understanding the psychology behind violence, whether it is domestic or tied to something larger like terrorism, it's this. We don't need perfect prediction. We need better recognition. We need to take patterns seriously, and we need to act before those patterns turn into tragedy. Because once that line is crossed, there's no going back. I want to thank you guys. I want you to give me comments in the comment section. Let me know what you think of this monologue. Again, I appreciate you tuning in for yet another episode, and we'll see you in the next one. Thank you so much. Peace.